Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be, and a very special Carnegie Endowment greeting to our viewers tuning in from the Indian Ocean region itself. From Maldives to Mauritius, Seychelles to Sri Lanka, wherever in the Indian Ocean you may sit or just happen to take an interest in, this is a region that spans countries and stretches from continent to continent. It's a region that covers up to 20% of the water on the Earth's surface. And if I may say so, it's a region that's becoming more important from year to year strategically, economically, and developmentally. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And before I go any further, I want to say a special thank you to our guests, Minister Jaishankar, the Minister of External Affairs, who will join us in a bit from New Delhi, and also Ambassadors Sandhu, Etienne, and Sinadinos of India, France, and Australia for joining us here in Washington. But I want to, and right at the very top, to recognize my Carnegie colleagues who've played the critical role in spearheading our fabulous new initiative, which is one of the only dedicated Indian Ocean programs around, and one that will, as I'm going to explain to you, leverage the very essence of what makes Carnegie into Carnegie. So let me recognize my colleagues, Darshana Barua, a newly minted Associate Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, who will direct this initiative for us, and also Ashley Tellis, my very old friend and longtime colleague who holds the Tata Chair in Strategic Affairs at Carnegie. And I want to acknowledge, too, the many colleagues around the Carnegie Global platform who will also be part of this effort to understand the Indian Ocean and think deeply, conceptually, and strategically about its future. Rudra Chaudhry, our director, and his colleagues at Carnegie India in New Delhi, Milan Vaishnav, who directs our South Asia efforts in Washington, and an array of others, encompassing scholarship on South Asia, East Asia, Africa, American statecraft, and Europe too. And this very diversity, I should add, says a lot about why we're here today. Now, to my mind at least, and I've spent much of my own career on the Pacific, the Indian Ocean was, in fact, the world's first truly global ocean, in the very best sense of interconnection among peoples, cultures, and regions. It has been, as one of my favorite historians, Harvard University's Sugata Bose, has put it, a part of the world that has for centuries teemed with people, commodities, and ideas, pilgrims and armies, commerce and labor, all linked through intricate social and economic webs. In other words, the interdependence, as Bose puts it, of the peoples of the lands beyond the horizon, from India to the Middle East, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. Now, of course, as I said, Carnegie is a global institution. And so who better, in my view, than a place that reflects diverse, multinational, multi-regional perspectives to help frame the debates that this very interconnectedness engenders, and also the challenges ahead. I want to make three very brief core points before I hand it to Darshana, who's going to moderate a terrific panel among our three ambassadors. Now, first, I often hear it said that the Indian Ocean is a fulcrum of geostrategic competition. In other words, a place where the interests of great powers intersect and where we see already the outlines of their intensifying competition for influence and impact. But let that not blind us to the fact that the Indian Ocean begins with the islands and peoples who live there. They are not objects of competition, but subjects of their own unique stories. And Indian Ocean island countries are forging a future, much as Pacific Island countries are forging a future that has, as its alpha and omega, their needs: growth, employment, innovation, development, opportunity. And so no discussion of the Indian Ocean can begin, much less end, by playing strategic basketball, as my former boss at the State Department, Rich Armitage, liked to put it in a different context, over the heads of the people who call it home. And that's why one of the programs under this initiative that we're proudest of is the Island Dialogue that we will launch in New York next week. And I invite our viewers to tune in again for that event, some of whose panels will be live streamed. We're bringing Indian Ocean islands and Pacific islands together to talk about precisely these subjects: growth, investment, innovation, the Blue Pacific, developmental needs, strategic challenges. So that's just one of the many stages on which we hope to showcase their island stories. And for all that we will inevitably talk about geopolitics and strategic competition, that is the alpha and omega of our approach at Carnegie too. Now, second, having said that, strategic competition is, of course, real, because after all, the world's major economic and military powers do have an interest in what happens in the Indian Ocean. India defines the entire Indian Ocean as its area of priority. Australia takes an interest in the Bay of Bengal and the Eastern Indian Ocean. Japan has a growing interest. The United States has a naval base in Diego Garcia and frequently transits the region with naval vessels. France is, in fact, a resident Indian Ocean power, in Réunion most notably. And then there's China, which has developed economic and military relations across the Indian Ocean at a time when strategic competition with all of the powers I just named is intensifying. And so one question is how to manage that competition in the interests of the Indian Ocean states themselves. But another, quite obviously, is how the interests of these major powers are themselves evolving and where they intersect. Now, third and last point, at Carnegie, we have a holistic view of, for example, Asia. And at a time when many people talk solely about the Indo-Pacific, as if that is the whole story, we are developing programs that focus both on the maritime space and the continental one. Now, I want to emphasize this because it situates this fabulous new initiative in the context of an organic view of, as I said, Asia in particular. Conflating Asia with maritime Asia and sea power, while often ignoring continental Asia and the land, is both a luxury and a conceit, particularly for the United States. And for many, not least in India, which faces a new set of circumstances in Afghanistan, for example, the reality is of an increasingly integrated strategic and economic space. And a country like China, for instance, has strategic interests both on the land and in the water that reflect increasingly integrated strategic concepts, realities, and ideas. And so with the launch of this new Indian Ocean initiative, we are building out at Carnegie an extraordinarily exciting body of maritime work, even as we also build out continental work simultaneously, strategically, and in a conceptually integrated way. And for me and my colleagues, Darshana, Ashley, Milan, Rudra, and so many others, this is what makes Carnegie such a special place. It's just incredibly exciting to work here. And our initiatives, like this one, reflect our uniquely global view, as befits the global and interconnected nature of the Indian Ocean itself. And so we couldn't be more proud of our team as we celebrate the launch of this new Indian Ocean initiative today. And I know you will all join me in wishing it success, but also in keeping up with the very exciting research and convening and dialogues that will flow from it. And so I thank you all for tuning in. It's going to be an exciting morning. But with that, let me hand it to my new colleague, Darshana Barua, Associate Fellow in the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment, to moderate our panel. Darshana, over to you.
Thank you, Evan, so much for that wonderful overview of the Indian Ocean region and what we aim to do today through the initiative. Welcome to all our viewers. Welcome to the first segment of our event today, a panel discussion on India, Australia, and France Trilateral Partnership in the Indian Ocean region. Just to provide an overview of the format and the event today, immediately after the panel discussion, we will have Dr. S. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister of India, for a keynote speech and a discussion with my senior colleague, Ashley Tellis. Coming back to this panel, the inaugural Trilateral Ministerial Dialogue between India, Australia, and France was held in May of 2021, earlier this year. Since then, we have already had many interactions between the three nations where Indian Ocean assumes a key component of the discussions. I often in my pieces talk about how India and France have worked collectively for so long in the Indian Ocean region. Probably very few know that France and Australia share a maritime border in the Southwest Indian Ocean region. So it is only, we think it is only apt that we have the three ambassadors of the three nations to the United States today here with us to discuss the importance of this trilateral partnership and the Indian Ocean in global security. The ambassadors need no introduction. We are delighted to have Arthurs Sinodinos, Ambassador of Australia to the United States, Philippe Etienne, Ambassador of France to the United States, and Taranjit Singh Sandhu, Ambassador of India to the United States. Welcome, ambassadors.
Thank you.
We are extremely delighted to host you for this panel discussion, launching Carnegie's Indian Ocean Initiative, which has been an effort in the making for months. And we hope to, as Evan, our Vice President, just discussed and shared with you, we will be doing much more within that region. So we thank you very much for your support and for to share with us and the Carnegie's Global Network how each of the countries look at the Indian Ocean and why this partnership is crucial in going forward. Ambassadors, if I may ask you to please share your opening remarks for about perhaps 7 to 8 minutes, and then I look forward to a discussion. And if I may start, Ambassador Sinodinos, if I may invite you to begin the discussion with your remarks on how Australia views the Indian Ocean and where does this trilateral partnership fit in. Ambassador Sinodinos, please.
Thank you, Darshana, and thank you to Carnegie for putting this great event. And I think we all look forward to hearing from Dr. Jai Shankar in due course. He's the main event. We're the entree. He's the main course. But we look forward to that. And great to again be with my friends, Ambassador Etienne and Ambassador Sandhu, both very distinguished and much more knowledgeable, I have to say, on this subject than I am. But wonderful to be in your company. And congratulations to Carnegie, and particularly to you, Darshana, for establishing this particular initiative. Because I think there's a perception that there's been insufficient attention and research on the Indian Ocean region. And this initiative, particularly with the prestige of Carnegie behind it, will go a long way to helping to correct that. I think the hope would be that we'd have a multiplier effect, drawing in more resources and attention to this critical region. And, you know, the Indian Ocean is vital to Australia's national interests. It's the Indo part in Indo-Pacific. And we have one of the longest Indian Ocean coastlines and its largest search and rescue zone. We have Indian Ocean territories, which are actually closer to India than they are to Canberra. And around half of our exports depart from Indian Ocean ports. Western Australia, where most of our commodities go out of, is obviously a major engine of the Australian economy, and their focus is very much on the region. They say they look north and west rather than east towards the eastern part of Australia. Now, the Indian Ocean region, like the broader Indo-Pacific, has become complex. It's buffeted by climate change, natural disasters, terrorism, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, transnational crimes such as piracy, trafficking of people, arms and drugs. These all threaten the sustainability and the security of our shared ocean. And the pandemic has exacerbated the strategic tensions and competition for influence. And the pressure on rules, norms and institutions has become acute. Now, we are playing in Australia an active role in tackling these challenges to realise our vision of an open, inclusive and resilient region and to shape the region's future for the benefit of all nations. We're doing this in a number of ways, including working with partners, both bilaterally and in various groupings. And this brings us to the Australia-India-France Trilateral. This trilateral is a partnership built on shared values. We are each proud democracies with a shared positive vision for an open, inclusive and resilient Indo-Pacific region. We have active foreign policies and are bringing together our resources to bear on the shape of the Indo-Pacific to help ensure that respect for rules prevails over the exercise of power. And we're committed to preserving the liberal international order that underpinned decades of stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. And may I say, this order is not exclusive. It's open. It's open to all those who want to respect the rules and norms. And Australia's commitment to the Indian Ocean region was clear in the third Indo-Pacific oration, which was delivered by our Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, just a few days ago on 11 September in New Delhi. The Foreign Minister stressed the importance of a practical and positive regional agenda, including through the trilateral efforts with India and France. And the Trilateral stands out for its momentum. It's building up momentum. Since September of last year, it has met at Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary, and senior official level. Foreign ministers will meet for the second time in the sidelines of UNGA next week. And we're committed to elevating the partnership to leaders level at the next opportunity. We have complementary strengths. Together, we represent a significant weight within the G20, and we field the three largest resident navies in the Indian Ocean region. And our Trilateral is focused on practical solutions to the challenges facing the region: health and economic recovery from the pandemic. Evan mentioned before maritime issues. For us, that's maritime safety and security, sustainability of our shared oceans, resilience to disasters, and mitigating and adapting to climate change. And of course, the pressures on regional and multilateral institutions that underpin our rules-based order. So the way we work together is practical, flexible, and positive, designed to enhance collective and respective capabilities to address these regional issues. Let me give you one example of trilateral cooperation in facing up to challenges in the Indian Ocean. Recently, our experts held a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief tabletop exercise at India's Information Fusion Centre for the Indian Ocean region. The exercise helped to develop a better understanding of risks in the region and how we can work together better to share information and respond to humanitarian disasters. What this does, by working together, doing these sorts of exercises, it builds up habits of cooperation. It gets us on the same page. It helps to create a similar mindset and approach to issues. And there are a lot of opportunities to build on this. So we look forward to working with France and India in this way. And to this end, it's pleasing to also see that the trilateral collaboration is beyond government to government. There's a 1.5 track dialogue delivered by Carnegie India. There's Frames Strategic Research Foundation and the National Security College at the Australian National University. The first trilateral 1.5 track dialogue met in April virtually and discussed opportunities for collaboration around maritime security, the blue economy, and critical technologies. Critical technologies, very important. These are emerging technologies which can have a transformative impact on society. Important for us to understand them and to be able to set standards in those areas. So again, let me wrap up by thanking Carnegie for inviting me and look forward to the discussion and Q&A.
Thank you, Ambassador, so much. That was a wonderful overview of Australia's perceptions. Ambassador Etienne, if I may turn to you now to share with us France's perspectives and importance of the Indian Ocean, which I think sometimes many in Washington forgets that France is a resident power in the Indian Ocean region. To you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, like Arthur, I want to thank Carnegie for inviting me and to congratulate you for the launch today of this crucial initiative. Indeed, France is an Indo-Pacific nation, not always very well known, with territories that give us the world's second largest exclusive economic zone, with interest, with population close to 2 million, not much, but still it matters very much for us, and with a permanent military force numbering more than 8,500 men. All of this has justified the establishment of a national strategy dedicated to Indo-Pacific that was just updated last July, and we can circulate it to you. Our goal is to act as an inclusive and stabilizing mediating power based on a lucid vision of the major issues at stake. Since President Macron's speech at Garden Island in Sydney in May 2018, and I was with him, I remember when I was his diplomatic advisor, France has been stepping up its actions in the Indo-Pacific around 4 main pillars: security and defense, 2, economic connectivity, research and innovation, 3, multilateralism and the rule of law, and 4, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable management of oceans. And I was 2 years ago visiting La Réunion, where one of my children is working as a doctor, and I remember how, and we know how La Réunion, for instance, is a treasure for biodiversity. I want to draw your attention on a dimension which is critical for France. It is a European dimension. We have, as France, inside the EU, I think succeeded so that the EU has also a growing interest and understand its fundamental interest in this region, and is now also, as EU, a European Union, in the process of taking the full measure and formulating its own European strategy, which will be one of the priorities of the French presidency of the European Union in the first half of next year. The coordination with our strategic partners is absolutely crucial. The implementation of our strategy cannot be seen without these major partnerships that have been developed with like-minded countries in the region based on a shared vision of our values, of the issues, the solutions. And I thank my Australian colleague who has absolutely beautifully described these common interests and values. In addition to the ASEAN, strategic partnerships exist with countries like India, Australia, Japan. A trilateral dialogue was put in place between France, India, and Australia, indeed, first with the permanent secretaries and with the ministers. And as Arthur has just said, a second ministerial meeting is about to take place in the coming days. The Indian Ocean plays a key role in our strategy for the Indo-Pacific, as it was clearly pointed out by our President Macron, when he visited La Réunion in October 2019. We have there 2 French overseas departments, territories, La Réunion and Mayotte, located in the region. Our armed forces, French armed forces in the southern zone of the Indian Ocean, are located in La Réunion, of course, but we have also pre-positioned forces in the United Arab Emirates and in Djibouti. And they contribute significantly to regional security, to the deepening of cooperation efforts, including with India, to interoperability, especially in the field of navies, as it has been said by my Australian colleague. We have also developed a diversified economic footprint in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean Commission, IOC, which is the only political organization on the southwestern region of the Indian Ocean, which is critical for the African rim of the Indian Ocean, and we will maybe come back to this dimension, is something very important for us. France has taken the presidency of the IOC for 2021-2022. Our objective is to relaunch regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean after interruptions due to the pandemic. France has also become a full member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and France is chairing the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium in 2021. So it's really a crucial dimension of our policy, and I look forward to our discussion, to the Q&A session, and I will be happy to give more details on these different dimensions. Thank you very much, Dana, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was wonderful. Turning to you, Ambassador Sandhu, coming to talk to us about India's perceptions of the Indian Ocean, which really is for Delhi the key priority theater within the Indo-Pacific strategy, or even otherwise. Ambassador Sandhu, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me also start by congratulating the Carnegie for the launching of the Indian Ocean Initiative. The launch is coming at a time when the term Indo-Pacific is perhaps increasingly becoming one of the most frequently used terms in the global strategic lexicon. I am also delighted to share this space with ambassadors of France and Australia, both of whom I have had the opportunity to know and engage and are good friends. France and Australia are also countries with which India has close partnerships. However, I think this would be the first time the three of us have come together in a trilateral format in Washington, D.C. Friends, the challenges that we face today as nations are far too complex to be tackled single-handedly. This mutual interdependence to me is not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength. It is the friendship that we cherish, the trust that we build, the connectivity that we craft that hold potential solutions to many of the pressing problems that confront today's world. As someone who has spent considerable time of one's diplomatic career in Sri Lanka and the United States, I am deeply conscious of India's rich maritime geography and the role it has played in shaping our history and contemporary partnerships. Throughout India's history, the Indian Ocean has been a melting pot for the confluence of diverse cultures. Much of our wealth and economic prosperity came from the maritime trade routes that traversed the Indian Ocean. The monsoon winds blowing over the Indian Ocean guided mariners and traders for centuries. In a civilizational sense, the Indian Ocean was the space for the movement of people, goods, and ideas across continents. While history and geography are given, contemporary realities of security, polity, and prosperity need to be shaped. In this regard, how successfully we shape cooperation and collaboration across the Indian Ocean is crucial to being able to significantly control events beyond it. We regard oceans as part of global commons. Our philosophy for maritime engagement in Indian Ocean was laid down by Prime Minister Modi in the concept of Sagar, which literally translates as ocean and signifies security and growth for all in the region. Stretching from the east coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf, to the Arabian Sea, to the Bay of Bengal, Malacca Straits, and the west coast of Australia, the Indian Ocean traverses different continents. As an Indian Ocean littoral country, India is a nation with 7,500 kilometers of coastline, 1,200 islands, and EEZ of 2.4 million square kilometers. More than 90% of India's trade by volume and 90% of our oil exports are carried out on the seas. The Indian Ocean is also a bridge with nations in our immediate and extended neighborhood. The seas that separate us are also the seas that connect us. India sees itself as a net provider of security in the Indian Ocean region. We also have been the first responder in HADR operations in the region, whether it's the floods in Sri Lanka or water scarcity in Maldives. We have responded with scale and speed, and that too within hours of the crisis. Our relationships with countries in the Indian Ocean are strong, and we are also helping build economic capabilities and improve maritime security for our friends and partners. During the COVID-19, we sent medical teams and supplied equipment to Indian Ocean island nations of Maldives, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, among other countries in the Indian Ocean region. We are active participants in different forums of regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean, including the Indian Ocean Rim Association and the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, through which we are advancing collective security. In November 2019, at the East Asia Summit in Bangkok, Prime Minister Modi announced the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is an open, non-treaty-based initiative drawing upon existing regional mechanisms. In 2020, we joined the Indian Ocean Commission as an observer. At the launch of this important initiative by Carnegie, I cannot conclude my remarks on Indian Ocean without mentioning the larger Indo-Pacific. Our vision of the Indo-Pacific was articulated in my Prime Minister's keynote address in Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018. We view the Indo-Pacific as a free, open, inclusive region which embraces all in the common pursuit of progress and prosperity. The centrality of ASEAN is a key element of the Indo-Pacific. There is convergence on this with our partners, whether it be under the Quad or Trilateral with France and Australia. Friends, during our presidency of UNSC, last month in August, Prime Minister Modi laid down 5 important principles of enhancing maritime security. Firstly, removing barriers from legitimate maritime trade. Secondly, peaceful settlement of maritime disputes based on international law. Thirdly, facing natural disasters and maritime threats by non-state actors together. Fourth, preserving maritime environment and maritime resources. And last, encouraging responsible maritime connectivity. These principles are the building blocks on which we seek to advance conversations and cooperation in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific with our partners. It was our famous poet Rabindranath Tagore who said that you cannot cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. I am glad that institutions like Carnegie are creating platforms to facilitate our plunge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you to all the 3 ambassadors for such and wonderful opening remarks, laying down each of the countries' perspectives on the Indian Ocean region. We do not often get to hear much about the Indo-Pacific, as Ambassador Sino has mentioned, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here to talk about that. We have about 20 minutes before we have the Dr. Jaishankar on for the keynote speech, and I thought I could have a few. I have a lot of questions. This is the most I think I've had in terms of Indian Ocean conversations. There aren't too many, but let me start with Ambassador Sandhu with a question to you. From you really defined the geography of the Indian Ocean for India, and I think there's sometimes confusion or clarification on it. What constitutes from the eastern coast of Africa to the Straits of Malacca, and that's how the Indian Navy looks at it as well. So the Indian Ocean is clearly important to Delhi. So my question to you is, does this create challenges in your interactions with other nations, particularly here in Washington, D.C., where the region might not hold the same level of priority, where maybe the Pacific or Southeast Asia holds higher priority in Washington? How does that work? How does that play out in your conversations in the US?
Look, I do not think that perception is entirely true. I would like to highlight a couple of points here. First, in foreign policy, you always have to look at the entire spectrum. I tell my friends here in DC that the United States has to look at our East and West with equal importance. It's a continuation. I'm confident that the United States would do it given their own interests. On the broader Indo-Pacific, of course, there has been a great deal of convergence between India and the United States and other partners such as Japan, Australia, and also France in our vision for a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific. Now, freedom of navigation, peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for territorial sovereignty, integrity, and a rule-based order are all parts of our shared Indo-Pacific vision. 2, on the Indian Ocean in particular, I would say that it is important to take into account India's own capabilities and advantages and use it for our shared interests. We have deep engagement and close partnerships in the region. As I said, India is a net security provider in the Indian Ocean. We are also first responders in HADR. These have been demonstrated several times, and my own experience in Sri Lanka, whether it's landslides, floods, Indian Navy and Sri Lankan Navy have worked hand in hand. Third, I want to highlight the mill-to-mill cooperation amongst our friends and partners with respect to that part of the world. Now, Indian Navy has been conducting exercises virtually with every country in the Indian Ocean region. Most recently, in July, August 2021, the Indian Navy participated in multinational Cut Class Experiment 2021 hosted by US AFRICOM off the coast of East, that is the east coast of Africa. Earlier this year, in April, India, Australia, Japan, and France, and the United States participated in another exercise in Bay of Bengal region. The exercise Malabar is another striking example. If you remember, last year's edition was held in IOR region. The phase 1 of this year's exercise was very recently hosted by United States. And fourth, information sharing is another aspect of cooperation. The Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region was set up in 2018 to coordinate with regional countries on maritime issues and act as a regional repository of maritime data. Several countries, including US, France, Australia, and Japan, have posted liaison officers in the Fusion Center. And lastly, I want to mention that our cooperation is not just in the area of maritime security, but also sustainability, connectivity, climate change, and related areas. So my point is that there's a lot happening out there, and I feel that there is a lot more that may happen in coming days ahead, given our shared interests and common challenges.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Etienne, if I may you mentioned about the 2 million people in the Indo-Pacific, out of which 1 million is in the Indian Ocean region, and the strategic territories and islands that are there, the Francis in the Indian Ocean region. And one of this is, of course, Reunion. I was wondering, can we expect trilateral cooperation utilizing such strategic geography in the Indian Ocean region to address issues of illegal fishing, unregulated IUU, unregulated fishing, or maritime domain awareness missions that are so common in bilateral or even trilateral between the 3 countries today that are here on the panel? Sorry, Ambassador, you're on mute.
Thank you very much for this great question. Of course, La Réunion is a crucial asset for this trilateral cooperation with India and Australia. And the priority areas of joint actions which have been identified many of them are in the maritime domain. The first one is maritime safety and security. Information sharing is crucial. My Indian colleague just mentioned it. Interoperability of our navies. Disaster response is absolutely essential. Second, priority management of marine resources and the environment. And here, as you mentioned, the fight against illegal and undeclared fishing is really something essential. By the way, our president, when he visited Polynesia, took also an initiative in the Pacific Ocean for better training of coast guards in the island states and step up the fight against illegal and undeclared fishing, but also the fight against plastic waste and marine pollution. I remember when France chaired the G7 back in 2019, we had the Prime Minister Morrison, Prime Minister Modi invited as guests to the G7 summit in France, as they were at the last British G7 summit. And we had a very strong cooperation starting there against pollution, and especially by plastics in the oceans. And we have also, especially with the Solar Alliance, with the French president and the Indian Prime Minister have launched a couple of years ago, a strong cooperation with our partners, including with this trilateral format with India and Australia in the field of renewable energies. And the Solar Alliance is for us very important, with its headquarters in India. And the third point, of course, is to frame all of these very concrete cooperation as much as possible and in a consistent way within the multilateral fora which exist. And of course, We have in view the presidency by India of the G20 in 2023, but already now we try to work on, as Ambassador Sinodino has said, in the G20, all three countries are very active there, and in all multilateral fora. So yes, so the fight against illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, but also the fight for more maritime domain awareness is clearly one of the big priorities based on the asset we have, not only with La Réunion as such as a territory, but also with our own institution. We have a network of agencies and research institute. We have our Agency for Development, AFD. We have Institut Pasteur, who is critical for biosciences, biotech. We have IFREMER, who is a leading research institution for ocean research. We have IRD, Institut pour la Recherche et le Développement, which is critical for development and science, or development and research. So we have all those French assets actually positioned in the region, in the Indian Ocean, and which are important basis for this trilateral cooperation and with regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean, including with the African countries of this region, of course.
Thank you, Ambassador. I really appreciate you bringing out the issues in the Indian Ocean region that requires the focus and attention, especially even as Evan had mentioned in his remarks, the island nations. A lot of these issues that directly impacts and has an impact and affects daily lives, a lot of on the littorals and the coast. So I think it'll be great to see this trilateral work on many of these issues. And as we have the three countries here, and I spoke about La Réunion, but there's also Andaman and Nicobar and Cocos Keeling of Australia, which are again three strategic islands in the Indian Ocean region. I think that provide a lot of opportunities for collaborations, and perhaps whether it's from the point of view of sustainable development, whether it's point of view of MDA or strategic geography, I think the relationship really is, the trilateral relationship does have a lot of potential. And I do hope back in the governments in Paris, Canberra and Delhi, they would see the value in perhaps utilizing these geographical assets in due course. Ambassador Sinodinos, if I may come to you in terms of the Indian Ocean, as you mentioned, of course, for Australia, there's a long coast, the western coast of Australia faces the Indian Ocean region. But even then, I think the Indian Ocean is considered a secondary sea for Australia's national priorities and strategic interests. Yet this trilateral partnership is, for Canberra, is key. What role can we see Australia play in the Indian Ocean? And within that, are there priority subregions or issues that are a focus, for instance, like Bay of Bengal, or do you also see the Indian Ocean similar to how India sees this, which is all the way to the coast of Africa and the western coast of Australia?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think the answer is that yes, we have tended in more recent times, including in our latest Defence Strategic Update, to talk about how our focus is increasingly on our own region, and people have interpreted that to mean the Pacific and Southeast Asia, particularly. There's Northeast Asia, but that's again a separate issue in some ways. But for us, yeah, the focus in the Indian Ocean is on the Northeast. Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, India. That's been a focus of some of the assistance that we provide and some of the cooperation we seek to do. But we see the two as interconnected, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And so for us, for example, the Quad, which brings together Japan, US, India, and Australia, is one way in which increasingly that interconnection is being viewed. And what the Quad is doing, I think, and this is a tribute in many ways to India, because India has really, I think, driven a lot of the elevation of the Quad in recent times. And that's been very important. But it's a very, again, that construct alongside the trilateral that we talk about here, Australia, India, and France, it's about having a positive vision of the region and what can be done. It's not about what we're against, it's what we're for. And in the Quad context, as Ambassador Sandhu can tell you, he's been very active, whether it's vaccines, climate critical and emerging technologies. And now with the Quad Leaders Summit next week in Washington, there'll be a focus on new areas as well. The point has been, how do we create mutual benefit in our region in a way which reflects also on us as like-minded nations who support a global rules-based order? So in Australia's particular case, while yes, we've had a Pacific step up, which has meant we're doing more with the Pacific Islands. And by the way, we're doing that in cooperation with France because of its interest in the Pacific. At the same time, we're doing more with the US in Southeast Asia. But in the northeast part of the Indian Ocean, as I mentioned, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, India, we're taking all sorts of initiatives. And there's a big opinion-making view in Australia these days, a view in opinion-making circles, that we have got to make more of our relationship with India, that we haven't tapped the full potential of that relationship. So the Quad, the Trilateral are all ways in which we do that. And for us, that means that while there's a perception that our focus has been mainly on Pacific and Southeast Asia, through these mechanisms, our focus increasingly has to become broader. And initiatives follow from that. So for us, this has been a very useful way to, if you like, recalibrate what we're doing. There's still a long way to go. It's a big ocean, there's lots happening. And while we take an interest in East Africa and other parts of the Indian Ocean, we basically deal in the areas where we feel we have a comparative advantage, or we're dealing with, for example, former Commonwealth countries where we have a connection. So in all these ways, we try and work with countries in the region. But as Ambassador Etienne said, there's a very clear agenda that's been laid out around sustainability, around maritime issues, which provides a real motor, making sure the Indian Ocean Rim Association is working as well as it can, all very important. That's why this initiative of yours in helping to put some intellectual horsepower behind these discussions is going to be important.
Thank you, Ambassador. We look forward to doing much more of these, and delighted to have started with this discussion. We have about 5 minutes left before we have to move to the keynote. So let me pose maybe a question each to you briefly as your concluding remarks. Ambassador Sandhu, if I could ask you, I'll pose it at the same time to the three of you just to save time. Ambassador Sandhu, if I could ask you to just share with us or reflect in terms of the key priorities from Indian point of view in this trilateral partnerships, what areas or issues are a priority area? Ambassador Etienne, if I may actually speak with you, I just got a note that we have maybe 5 more minutes. So let me ask this question, because France is, I know you have a hard stop. France is one of the key players who have been very present in the African coast, the eastern coast of Africa. And that is a coast that is often lost in the Indo-Pacific conversations, where it gets perhaps brushed under the continental Africa issues. Why is there such a divide within the Indian Ocean region in this view? Why is Africa so removed perhaps the other parts of it? And how does France look at it? And Ambassador Etienne, I would welcome similar thoughts from you in terms of the concluding remarks, where the Indian Ocean fits in Australia's global aspirations in terms of going forward. You have really provided a lot of key detailed issues in terms of the work moving forward, but keeping in mind the Pacific step up, keeping in mind the resource constraints, keeping in mind the China challenge, I would say, how would you perhaps place the Indian Ocean in Australia's geopolitical engagements? Ambassador Sandhu, if I may start with you.
So, Darshana, as maritime democracies and resident countries in Indo-Pacific, three of us have shared and interests and varied capabilities, as I have mentioned. The main objective, of course, of the trilateral dialogue is free, open, inclusive, peaceful Indo-Pacific. And we are all working together with like-minded countries in the region for this purpose. And broadly, I would say 3 pillars of this partnership. First, maritime security and HADR. Second would be protection of marine global commons and environment. And third would be multilateral cooperation. And if you see the joint statement, which was adopted after the Trilateral Ministerial Dialogue, the conversations between our three countries cover a wide array of areas, and that include enhancing trilateral cooperation to meet the challenges from COVID-19, combating climate change, and working together through mechanisms such as International Solar Alliance and coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure. Now, cooperation on counterterrorism and against non-traditional threats is another potential area where we can work together.
Thank you, Ambassador Ambassador Etienne, on the question of Africa in the Indian Ocean.
One point on Africa and two conclusive remarks on Africa. Yes, we must involve more the countries of the African rim of the Indian Ocean, and we have a lot of cooperations already, but we must involve them also. I will just give you one example. We have this mission, European mission against piracy in the Gulf of Aden called Atalante. And we think we have here instruments to enlarge those instruments to the question of maritime security, which is a common challenge for the whole region of the Indian Ocean. So we have the possibility to include those countries in spite of the different crises which are there. And as I said, we are very much working with them inside the Indian Ocean Commission, which we are chairing in this year and next year. So it's really one organization where we can work very much with countries, African countries, Madagascar, and all the issues we mentioned are of keen interest to them, the security, but also biodiversity, fight against climate change. My final remarks is that based on our experience in La Réunion, is that we have an extremely rich, we have incredible assets, but not only natural, but also human assets. We are so blessed to have in La Réunion a population with all those different origins. And it's the same in many other island states and also in the other parts of this region. It is something we really must realize to work together, because we are already there with our communities. And my last remark is that our priorities, I mentioned already the priorities for our trilateral format, and my Indian and Australian colleagues, everything they said, I completely agreed with. But I think one very interesting opportunity we have in this Indian Ocean, and especially with this trilateral format, is to try to combine two priorities, which are economy and environment, and to start to develop together what we could call a blue economy based on economic development, sustainability, and the wise and sustainable relation and use of maritime and sea resources. It is also for us a priority, and I come back to the human riches we have to increase training and student mobility in these regions. It is one dimension which we must not lose from sight, to exchange more and more young people, especially students, and to increase training capacities in all the region, especially with this idea of sustainability and environment plus economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Etienne. That was wonderful. Ambassador Xinos, please.
Oh, thanks. Look, from Australia's perspective, as I mentioned before, probably the northeast part of the Indian Ocean is where, given our comparative advantage, we probably have the most value to add. It is a priority to further develop the relationship with India. I think over the years, there have been some stops and starts in this regard, but I think now, with the full economic potential of India starting to be realized, it's important for us to really upgrade the relationship. There's a whole series of initiatives coming. We're discussing with India further the concept of an economic agreement leading to a trade agreement. That's going to be very important as providing a setting for the relationship. So for us, working in the Trilateral, working in the Quad and all these other mechanisms, habits of cooperation, which help us to better understand the region and better understand how we bring complementary capabilities and assets to work with each other. We don't necessarily all bring the same things to the table. We bring complementary attributes to the table, and I think that will work. That will work very well. Just on the issue of geostrategic competition, our attitude to that is, look, we want a region which is open, inclusive, resilient, and all the rest of it, and in which countries respect rules and norms. By us as like-minded countries who believe in a global rules-based order, which believe in concepts of democracy and rule of law, by us working together, we create standards and set standards in the region. And that, I think, can be very good in providing leadership to particularly smaller countries in the region, and also indicate to larger countries that as if they're all willing to live by the same rules, it can be a very peaceful and prosperous region. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for ending that on a hopeful and a positive note. I know each one of you have a very busy schedule, and especially I'm guessing Ambassador Sandhu and Srinivas with the Quad Summit coming up. So we are running a few minutes behind on the External Affairs Minister's speech, but I will say thank you here and perhaps have a conversation with my colleague Ashley Tellis while we wait for the Minister to join us. But Ambassador, thank you so very much for joining us this morning, despite your busy schedules, and helping us launch this Indian Ocean initiative. We very much look forward to working with you and your offices in the coming days, weeks, months, and over the years. Thank you once again for making time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye, ambassadors.
Thank you.
If I can now, that was a wonderful conversation, but if I can maybe perhaps introduce the next segment of our event. And as I mentioned, the Minister, of course, given the busy schedule that has been running behind in Delhi, I'm not surprised that he's a few minutes behind schedule. But I thought I will take this opportunity to welcome Ashley Tellis, my senior colleague, and also been a big supporter of this initiative along with our Vice President Evan Fagenbaum to the screen, and who will take forward the next segment of the conversation with Dr. Jaishankar. But since I have you on screen and we have a few minutes, and we just heard really, I think what I thought was really great set of conversations from the three ambassadors outlining what is the important areas in the Indian Ocean region. And I particularly liked the outlining of the non-traditional security issues, which I think often gets lost amongst the geopolitics, but are areas that are directly of interest and perhaps our request for littorals and islands. Let me direct the question to you in terms of how Washington is viewing the Indian Ocean region. Are we going to see perhaps maybe more engagement? Is there an interest? We've seen Secretary Austin, when he visited India, there was a remark on Western Indian Ocean region. So is there a growing interest in Washington within the policymakers and the strategic community on the Indian Ocean region?
I think, Darshana, there is a clear understanding that the previous view of the Indian Ocean as separate from the Pacific, that view is not tenable anymore. The interconnections between the two spaces are becoming more and more manifest. And that is partly because there is a new great power that has entered the Indian Ocean, and that's China. It's partly because the geographic states that border both oceans, and Australia is a great example, France is another, in a different way, Great Britain is too. They have to think about the security implications of developments in both spaces. And so the comfortable separation that we had between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific is now a thing of the past. Now, having said all this, you've got to also appreciate that there are differences in priority. And for the United States, the biggest strategic challenges are still to the east of the Indian Ocean.
So do you see in terms of in the conversation with India itself also, I mean, of course, Washington has parallel conversation with its allies and friends, but we've seen, of course, the conversation, especially on the naval side of it, has really multiplied across many domains. We've seen, I think, progress in areas that was perhaps unimaginable 5 years ago. Last year, P-8s landed in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, utilizing LIMOA to refuel. There is more of a conversation around information sharing in maritime domain awareness. So do you see more of these sort of engagements and conversations, keeping in mind what you just said in terms of that the burden on the Pacific is much higher? That means perhaps Washington is going to look to leverage its partnerships in the Indian Ocean region to address its security concerns or its interests. And in that, what would you say would be kind of the next few steps, having covered such big grounds, I think big steps in a short span of time after resistance for perhaps years? What would be the next steps in the India-US relationship on the maritime side of it, particularly if you had any thoughts on the Indian Ocean?
So Darshan, let me contextualize some of the examples that you gave, because they are dramatic because they've not occurred before. And one can understand why it gets all the attention. But from a US point of view, it's really in many ways the third priority. The first priority is still diplomatic. And the importance of having a rule-based order in the region, transcends any of the specific examples that you gave. And the fact that India has now lent its weight to the arguments of that rule-based order are absolutely critical. The second element is really economic. And by economic, I mean broadly everything from trade to the environment and so on and so forth. I think the United States recognizes that in many ways, the business of Asia is still business. And we have to be responsive to the demands of prosperity that emerge from the region. And so our engagement with India is seen equally in terms of this broader network of prosperity that we want to protect. And that's why it's not surprising to me that the Quad has focused on things like critical technologies and so on and so forth. And the military really is third in that order of preference. It's not unimportant, but it must be appreciated for what it is in a bigger context.
No, that's really helpful too, because you're right in terms of a lot of the developments do seem dramatic because they haven't occurred. They have taken so long to materialize, whether it was LIMOA, whether it was Kamkasa, whether it was Becca, because of the resistance, I think, or hesitancy from Delhi, or the relationship between India and US. There seems to be that the whole focus is perhaps on the military side of it. So this is really great. The one question I did have, and I think it came out quite a bit in the panel discussion as well, that when countries are talking about collaborations, when countries are talking about offering solutions to the region, or even talking about, I guess, what can be done in bilateral relationship and trilateral relationships, non-traditional security issues of climate change, issues of blue economy, issues of sustainable development, they are clearly coming up higher and higher in foreign policy and discussion agendas. It's no longer that I think a very sharp division, perhaps in the past, there has been sharp divisions where illegal fishing would be of issue of softer issue that need not require your attention, or issues of sustainable development. But today, I mean, all the three ambassadors mentioned it as their priority areas for the three countries when asked about the issues that was there as well. Do you see a similar approach in terms of from Washington in engaging in many of these issues? Are these areas as whole similar priorities, even within the geopolitics of it? Because this is what, again, when you have conversations with islands, these would rank at the top 5 security challenges for the region, and not necessarily military conflict. So how would you, could you share with us in terms of how Washington views this?
Well, I can't speak for Washington, I can't speak for the administration, but I would say if we pay attention to these issues, we run the risk of undermining our larger geopolitical interests. Because you're absolutely right. We cannot impose on the region our priorities. Our priorities are important to us and we will pursue them because we have no choice. But if we want partners to work with us in the achievement of our priorities, then I think it is inevitable that we will have to pay some regard to the priorities of others, which may not be our own. And so even if we are not inclined to begin with, to pay attention to these issues of low politics that you flagged, I think there is a real risk that we undermine our interests in the realms of high politics if we are inattentive to the interests of the region. I want to go back, very quickly to a point that Evan made at the beginning. If we treat the Indian Ocean states as the objects of our grand strategy, they are not going to be partners in helping us achieve the objectives of our grand strategy. So there has to be an attentiveness to their concerns and a responsiveness to their concerns. And to the degree that we can show ourselves to be good partners with them, the better our chances of achieving our objectives in the realm of high politics.
Great. Thank you, Ashley, so much. I think the minister is here with us now, and we'd be moving on to the next segment of our event, where we have Dr. S. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, give us a keynote address on the launch of the Indian Ocean Initiative, and followed by a conversation with Ashley Ellis. Ashley, I will hand it over to you. Minister Jaishankar, welcome, and thank you so much for making time. Ashley, over to you.
Well, thank you, Darshana. I cannot tell you what a privilege it is and what a pleasure it is for me personally to welcome Dr. Jaishankar, India's Minister for External Affairs, back to the Carnegie Endowment. I have very fond memories of the many occasions in which he visited the endowment. And actually, if memory serves, on at least 2 occasions, offering a quite masterful address about the way India sees its relationship with the United States and in the world. And so my only regret today is that I have to speak to him across an electronic medium, as opposed to speaking to him in the same room. But all the same, I want to welcome him here because it is really important to us what his presence signifies. He, of course, needs no introduction, but he deserves one. And I'm going to give him the briefest of introductions, just to remind any of the folks who have tuned in who may have forgotten. He's had a very distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service. He served as India's ambassador successively to the Czech Republic, to Singapore, to China, and the United States, before retiring literally at the acme of his bureaucratic profession when he served as Foreign Secretary. He was also pivotal, actually, to the achievement of the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, right from its early days, when it existed in embryonic form as the new steps of strategic partnership, all the way to the end, when we completed the many serial steps in the completion of the agreement. He's had a career in the private sector, where he worked for the Tatas, and is also the author of a remarkable book called The India Way, which I reviewed actually for Carnegie a few months ago, and which I would commend to the readership of all those viewing here. Because of the program that we have today, which is on the Indian Ocean and the launch of this initiative, I really think there's no better person to address this gathering. because other than Prime Minister Modi, Dr. Jaishankar has been the staunchest champion of India returning as a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific space. He has consistently made the argument that India should be ramping up its investments to sustain the return to the maritime role that it once played prior to the colonial era. And if India succeeds in that ambition, it will be due to in no small measure because of the efforts that he is making in his current role as Minister of External Affairs and as a member of the Cabinet Committee on Security. So without further ado, I want to welcome you, Dr. Jaishankar. It is wonderful to see you. I will give you the floor to offer brief remarks, and then I hope we will have the opportunity to have a conversation. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you. Ashley, Darshana, let me say it's really great to be back with Carnegie. And like you, Ashley, I'm thankful that we still connect, but I would have much rather connected, of course, in person. So what I thought was just to kick off a discussion on the conversation on the Indian Ocean. Let me share with you some points which to me lay out a kind of an Indian perspective of the Indian Ocean. I try to sort of discipline my thoughts into 8 points. So I will put those 8 points out. And the first point is really that, unlike the last few centuries when the developments in the oceans determine the course of events on land, today we are actually seeing that logic inverted to some extent. You have facilities in littoral states, including those set up through connectivity initiatives, actually having very significant maritime implications. So I would argue that the sea-land dynamic is still a dynamic, but not quite the way it was before. Okay. The second point I would make is that the Indian Ocean itself historically had an organic unity. And I think that's very, very important today for Indian Ocean countries to recall and, in a sense, I won't say reinvent, but certainly refresh. And a lot of that organic unity, of course, derived from the monsoons. And the monsoons were the sort of the driving force of the Indian Ocean activity. It was in many ways, of course, a very pluralistic, very syncretic culture of the Indian Ocean. I'll come to that later. And that the era of Western imperialism actually broke this up. I mean, what the period, those 200 years plus did was, it created very distinct sub-regions, like the Indian subcontinent, like the Gulf, like Southeast Asia. And in a sense, compartmentalized them. Today, actually interfacing them again is a very big challenge. Certainly when India talks about Indian foreign policy today, talks about neighborhood first, which is consolidation within the Indian subcontinent, but then talks about Act East policy towards Southeast Asia or link west towards the Gulf. This is a rebuilding of linkages to the extended neighborhood, which was broken up in these 200 years. And also, I think, in many ways, by the partition of India. Because I think that was a very serious strategic event whose full consequences is not always appreciated by people. The third point I would flag for attention today is that considering that we have such a large coastline, a vast expanse of ocean below us, so many islands, it's interesting that it's only in 2015 that India actually formally adopted a comprehensive maritime strategy. And this was done when Prime Minister Modi went to Mauritius in March of 2015. He gave it the acronym of SAGAR, which is a word for ocean in Hindi. And but what it has done, this comprehensive view, it has actually created, I would say, outlook cutting across bureaucracies and departmental silos. So you've seen much more maritime activity and maritime commitments. You've seen a ramp up of HADR operations. There have been 7 big ones, actually, without counting even the COVID-related operations. A large number of coastal surveillance agreements with Indian Ocean partners. White shipping agreements with 22 countries. Many more are still in the pipeline. A hydrographic cooperation with 6 countries. And military training in the Indian Ocean region with 11 countries. All in all, actually, India has acquired the reputation of being a first responder. And to that extent, I would say it's a kind of a theory, it's a praxis example. You create the theory, you then implement it, and that strengthens the theory. The fourth point, which I touched on earlier in my remarks, is the Indian Ocean has actually got a very strong ethos, very strong culture of coexistence, of adjustment, of diversity. And in that sense, it really underpins a multipolar Asia, which is really a key building block for a multipolar world. So today, I would kind of work that logic backwards. You want a multipolar world, you need a multipolar Asia. You want a multipolar Asia, you need to make the Indian Ocean culture of diversity and pluralism succeed. My fifth point, the centrality of the Indian Ocean to global development has actually grown in the last few decades. And it has grown because of the rebalancing in the world order. That as Asia's salience has increased, as Asia's economic weight has increased, as trade routes have grown, there's been a strategic consequence to all of that. And this is important to an audience which has historically been more focused on the Atlantic and the Pacific to understand. So when you think in power terms, in national terms of a rebalancing, and say, okay, China and India, say, have grown much bigger, Asia's growth in weight has increased. Do look at the maritime, the parallel maritime rebalancing which has taken place, which is actually the Indian Ocean has gained in prominence and significance as compared to the Pacific and the Atlantic. My sixth point would be that we have, after the Second World War, treated the Pacific and the Indian Ocean as very distinct theaters. And there's a good reason for it. A lot of it is to do with the United States. I think because the United States was so dominant in the Pacific and was, the immediate post-war strategy was very Japan-centered. Then there were the events in China, the Korean War, eventually leading on to the Vietnam War. In a sense, Pacific was more American, and at least in the 50s, Indian Ocean was more British. And then, as as British power receded, you actually had, I would say, a definitional wall between them, different degrees of commitments, different degrees of presence. But that separation between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, I think, has become less and less tenable. I would argue partly because the Northeast Asian countries are today much more visible in the Indian Ocean, Japan, Korea, most of all China. And the Indian Ocean countries, many of them, especially India, much more visible in the Pacific. And the United States actually treating the Indian and the Pacific in a much more integrated manner than it has ever done before. So Indo-Pacific, it's very difficult today to talk of the Indian Ocean without really going into the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific, I don't think is anymore an argument or a debate. I think it's pretty much a reality. It is definitely a policy for a lot of countries. So we need to take that as an assumption. Now, my second point, within the Indian Ocean, within the Indo-Pacific, we have actually seen cooperation grow very rapidly, variety of reasons. Now, typically, I don't say this as a criticism, but we, in our business, and particularly your business, Ashley, you tend to look at it much more as hard security. Whereas I would say it's both the reality warrants and I would even say the politics warrant a much more rounded approach that we look at a lot of other factors other than hard security. And an interesting initiative in this context is actually one which India had tabled at the East Asia Summit 2 years ago. It's called the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And it has 8 pillars. It looks at, ecology, environment, connectivity, obviously, the educational, scientific exchanges. And there's been, COVID, of course, has disrupted some of this, but already the Australians, the Japanese, the Indonesians, the French have all bought into it by agreeing to lead various pillars in this basket of it. And my final point, the changes which I've spoken about, the rebalancing, the need to treat the Indian and the Pacific Ocean as a much more integrated setup. The political reflection of a lot of these changes is expressed in the Quad. And again, I want to highlight that the Quad has an agenda which extends to multiple domains, to much broader cooperation. I think to keep it, to make it, in a sense, give it a sharp edge and a very limited agenda, partly, I think, is a gamesmanship of critics. But I think it's partly also, frankly, a headlines kind of attitude, not a full understanding of really what is happening. Because I think, as we will see later on in the month, I think the Quad has an increasing agenda, a substantive agenda, which will actually cover multiple spheres of activities. But again, without in any way diminishing Quad, I also want to point out that Quad is not unique, that there are other plurilaterals. There are other plurilaterals in the world, but there are other plurilaterals even in the Indo-Pacific region. And we ourselves, when I look at it, we have plurilaterals, which means more than 2, arrangement with Australia and Japan, but also with Indonesia, with France, with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives. In a sense, this is a larger generic point on the evolution of the international order, that as multilateralism shows an inability to deliver on the key issues of the day, and as bilateralism has its limits, I think that gap is today increasingly going to be filled with understandings and activities of the willing and the cooperative. And international relations today has to take that into account rather than debating whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because it's there, it's part of life. So these are some of my initial thoughts, but once again, really thank you for having me over today digitally, and once again, really my good wishes, and I'd be happy to begin the conversation with you, Ashley.
Well, thank you so very much. First, of course, thank you for making the time, and thank you for offering those very thoughtful remarks. in some ways, you've made my life really harder because the richness of your remarks encompasses such a broad array of themes that I think it will be virtually impossible to engage every one of them. But there were three themes that, just listening to you speak, jump out at me. And so I want to engage you on each of those three themes sort of sequentially. The first is the continuing sort of dialectical tension between fragmentation and unification. You mentioned the colonial legacy and the contribution that it made. I wonder whether those pressures for fragmentation still do not persist, may not be in a colonial guise, but in the guise that there are new architectures, new infrastructure plans, et cetera, that have had the consequence of actually dividing the region in many ways rather than achieving that ambition of unification. In other words, if there are geopolitical pressures that are pushing for fragmentation, can this fragmentation be overcome by alternative instruments relating to economic integration, soft security, and so on and so forth? How do you see the struggle between fragmentation and unification today going forward?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and quite honestly, Ashley, you kind of improved on my observation. I think you've set it out in a very, very sharp conceptual way. Look, in a sense, I would argue both fragmentation and unification are extreme positions. Fragmentation could be past fragmentation, there could be new fragmentations, and where if while we want more integration, if that happens in a sense under the rubric of a much more unipolar worldview, then I would argue that is obviously not in the overall interest of the region. So as always, or not as always, but as very often, I think the best answers lie somewhere in the middle, which is why the middle path is embodied with so many virtues. And to me, the middle, getting the balance right would be actually create a much more participative, much more consultative, in a sense, a much more coordinated, cooperative kind of Indo-Pacific. Now, I recognize it's easier said than done. And, some weeks ago, I had actually spoken at some length in Australia and in the ANU, contrasting how actually Europe has dealt with these challenges as opposed to Asia. And the fact is, we in Asia are struggling with it for a variety of reasons. So I think a lot of what you are going to see now, which you already see, these are those efforts, And certainly, I think I'm just giving you Quad as an example because of my last comment. It is an effort at cooperation. It is an effort at cooperation between four countries who are actually located, in a sense, at four corners of the Indo-Pacific, but who are all impelled by a sense of responsibility for global good and duty towards the global commons, who have found it possible, who have the comfort today to work with each other. Mind you, each one has made an extra effort. I mean, it wasn't something which was predestined. In fact, recent history was a little different. But they've all tried to overcome that, approach their global responsibilities with a more open mind. And I think are trying to say, okay, how do we work with this? Now, I think that the other efforts, as I said, there are many trilaterals out there. The East Asia Summit and the ASEAN forums also themselves add to some of this. You will have, it's a big region. It's a very complicated region. It will have many building blocks of many kinds. And the right thing is to be open to all of them, rather than, get into a very sort of binary with me against me kind of output.
Yes. I was actually just remarking to Darshana before you came on the line, Mr. Minister, that the success of the US, particularly in the Indo-Pacific space, will depend so much on our attentiveness to the concerns of individual players in the region, which is, instead of thinking of them as purely objects in a larger contest, to sort of internalize their concerns and work with them. Now, you mentioned in your remarks the effort and the investments that India is making, for example, with respect to HADR, with respect to maritime cooperation, in environmental management, disaster relief, the whole 9 yards. The question that lurks at the back of my mind is that, will these investments in what you might call low politics, and by that I don't mean its unimportance, but just the world outside of geopolitical competition, will these investments in low politics suffice to bring the region closer to the unity that you described as once characteristic prior to the era of colonialism? Or will these efforts become victims of these larger tectonic struggles at the level of high politics? Just practically, given the investments that you've seen India make in the last 3 to 4 years, how do you see this shaping up?
Well, look, theoretically, your question is a valid one. Obviously, anybody who's in the policy-making world would like to see the best outcomes of their policy. So my answers are inherently biased here, which is, I would like to see this succeed. I would like to see greater cooperation. We have tried not to play into a polarized world sort of scenario. I'm not suggesting it would be easy. I'm also not in denial of the realities of geopolitics. After all, I do it for a living. But my sense is it should be our endeavor to try to widen the areas of convergence and commonalities, because that is how regions actually develop. My sense is, if you actually ask people philosophically and even practically, saying, look, would you like to see some kind of lowest common denominator which is continuously raised in terms of what are the common interests of the region? I think almost everybody would say yes. Now, there will be, when there are difficult relationships, I think they will have to be, in a sense, reconciled with this direction. That process will have its challenges. But again, I would argue that such a vision, and it's not just a vision, I think there is a practical basis for it, actually will have a dampening effect on very sharp competition. As it is, in a sense, globalization is a constraining force.
Yes.
In the way international competition works. But I would argue that the more platforms you have, the more people work with each other, the larger the consensus. I think all of this will be contributing. So, to my mind, rather than you post it in sense of unification, fragmentation, I would also say stability, instability. To my mind, these are all stabilizing. We'll never have perfect stability, but there'll certainly be mitigative and contributive factors to how the region would develop.
And you have a great asset going in, and the asset you have growing in is that almost every country in the region shares these goals, as you pointed out. Every country in the region wants to protect its independence, wants to protect prosperity, wants to deepen the linkages. The question I have, and I want to transition to a second theme in a minute, but the last question I have on this theme is, do you believe that the community of countries that care about freedom and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific are applying the right quantum of resources to attaining these objectives? Or is there still a gap between what our aspirations would require us to do and what we're actually doing?
In the real world, actually, there'll always be a gap. There will always be a gap because our aspirations will always be ahead of reality. Our promises will always be ahead of performance. It's in the nature. It's in the nature of public policy making. Again, if you look at it, a lot of countries, even before the COVID, but especially after the COVID, are extremely concerned about rebuilding at home, most notably the United States. And therefore, a lot of foreign policy and strategic postures will be based, they will not be capability driven or resources driven. They will be capability and resources optimized. But we'll have limited capability and resources. The task will be bigger than those capability and resources can address. And my senses will both be creative on how we use it, but creative also in terms of understandings and arrangements. And I think if you look at the evolution in the thinking of many, many countries in the Indo-Pacific, one of the big changes today is the fact that there's a greater willingness to work with others. And the United States, I think, in my view, has been especially notable in making that transition.
I want to use this as the opportunity to transition to the second big theme that I saw coming out of your remarks. And that is the persistent invocation, explicit and implicit, about the importance of multipolarity and the emergence of multipolarity. Not just multipolarity in Asia, but multipolarity in Asia as a stepping stone to multipolarity globally, with all the implications for stability thereof. Now, this takes us into a somewhat, uncomfortable area. And that is, do you have the sense that while India has a vision of a multipolar Asia, that vision is shared to a greater or lesser degree by the other Asian states as well? And what are the implications of the differences in perception on that count?
The answer to that would be that most of the major states in Asia would subscribe to multipolarity. Okay. Now, here is the sort of dilemma of international relations. When power reaches a point where you feel, remember, multipolarity doesn't mean equal poles.
Yes.
It means poles of multiple weightages. I think more enlightened policies would look at an architecture, would look at a long-term sort of stability and as a factor, would to a greater degree perhaps respect the interests of others, because it's in your own interest that they too have a level of comfort, because that comfort really creates greater stability. Now, I cannot guarantee that everybody would necessarily have that kind of sober, enlightened, far-seeing view of a evolving architecture, because the history of the world has shown that has from time to time not been the case. But if you ask me, would the bulk of the countries subscribe to a multipolar Asia? Yes, I think in a sense, the overall sense, feeling would be not just for multipolarity, because, in some cases it would be national multipolarity, but, we have, for example, the ASEAN, which is in many ways a very successful collective, where there are actually, certainly in Asia, it has been the best regional, most successful regional organization. And it has a fairly well-developed sense of its collective interests.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at multipolarity, to me, ASEAN, for example, would be a pole. Maybe even within ASEAN, a very important country like Indonesia would be a pole. So keeping that in mind, I think generally there would be a strong support for multipolarity, for a more democratic, consultative sort of decision making and deliberative way of managing Asia. In many ways, the East Asia summit process, the ARF, the ADMM, all these are all platforms which contribute to that. But we are still in a relatively, I would say, early stage of evolution. When you compare it to Europe, for instance,
yes,
you can see the difference. But I do take the point that what kind of multipolarity, and for example, to me, multipolarity would not be uniform, but would not be hierarchical. So
I'm glad you raised that last point, because to my mind, that is the rub of the whole question. You can have a multipolarity in terms of differences in capabilities, but does that then translate into limitations on one's autonomy and freedom to choose? And if you have a vision of multipolarity that is hierarchical, with states progressively losing their autonomy depending on where they fit into the scale, then that's certainly not the multipolarity, obviously, that you would consider to be desirable.
Actually, all I can say is India did not accept a hierarchy when India was very much weaker. If you look at the 1950s and 60s, the purpose of non-alignment was exactly to expand our space and ability to make choices. And it was also a very clear sense that, the world will change, time is with us, we will go up the ladder. And sure enough, 75 years later, I think we can, the world has evolved, we have evolved. In the earlier phases, we used to worry about how to maneuver between poles. Today, we would be moving in the direction of becoming one of the poles. I think there's still a lot of space there to be covered. But certainly, I don't think anybody can make a credible case to Indians or in India why we should accept constraining of choices or hierarchical order.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, because I think that is really what is at the minds of many, particularly in the United States. I know your time is really at a premium, but I do want to ask you just one last question, because it was such an important theme in your 8 points, and that is the whole issue of rebalancing. The United States has expressed an intention to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific, and you have seen our own discussions in this country now going back, over 10 years. I want to ask you about India's challenges with respect to rebalancing, and in particular, the dilemma that India faces with respect to its continental versus its maritime commitments. It seems to me that one of the consequences of our departure from Afghanistan is that the security environment in India's continental spaces has become more complicated. Partly because there is a threat of the resurgence of terrorism, partly because the overarching ideas about jihadism triumphant have not been extinguished, and partly because new players now have emerged on the scene with the capability to cause India real harm. The question I have for you is, what bearing will these challenges have on India's ability to play in this bigger maritime space? Will there be distractions in terms of constraints on leadership time? Will there be constraints in terms of resources that you can apply, and so on and so forth? How do you see India juggling between the continental and the maritime challenges?
Before I come to that, if I can just say a few words about rebalancing itself, because rebalancing is a very broad, sweeping term, and it all depends on the domain to which you apply it, and the parameters which actually go into your definition of rebalancing. Obviously, economic rebalancing was one, in a way, I would say, the primary driver. Definitely political and capability rebalancing, which comes with that. But I think there is also, to a great extent, the next phase, which is a kind of a cultural and a narratives rebalancing. Certainly, I think one of the challenges today is to get people to have a balanced appreciation that the progress of India doesn't mean India looks more and more like the West. In fact, the progress of India will mean India looks more and more like India. And it's time that people in the Western world, particularly in the United States, have actually a better understanding of what that means. I would say the fact that in many ways, concepts which we share, practices we share, values we share, will express themselves in a diverse way, precisely because we are located in different parts of the world with different histories. Now, in terms of the continental versus maritime, again, there are two aspects or three aspects to it. One, as I pointed out, especially after 2015, there's been a much greater Indian focus on maritime.
Yes.
Number two, as you grow, but your challenges also grow, the entire exercise is about optimizing. As I said, show me there are very few countries in the world which will speak of a surfeit of resources. And certainly that's a much harder situation in democratic societies, where there is so much pressure today to address the immediate problems of quality of life and so on. What you said about Afghanistan and the resulting complications, the way you put it. Again, look, I'm not. I often read an analysis about, do you have the bandwidth? I mean, can you give attention to two problems? I mean, people in governance give attention to 100 problems at the same time, and governance and policy making is not for people with a narrow bandwidth. It is, in fact, this ability to address multiple challenges, prioritize, optimize, to some extent pursue parallel tracks, sometimes even contradictory tracks. I mean, this is really what governance and policy making is about. So I do see your point about the greater complexity of challenges we face in our own national security environment. But to my mind, the part of the answers, I say this as a foreign minister, part of the securities answers lie in foreign policy. It's my responsibility to ensure that my country has the understandings with partners abroad, and which may be very different partners. You know, my partners, let us say, in addressing the challenges which come out of Afghanistan, would be very, very different from, or could be very different from my partners with whom I work with on the Indo-Pacific. So it is this ability to shall I say, broaden our set of partners, keep those relationships well-oiled, make sure there are enough convergences and overlaps for for good working understanding. I think this is part of the challenge, and I would say today's foreign policy. I mean, first of all, it at one level it's more, issues are much more integrated, but very often you have to work with partners of choice on issues of choice. Sometimes in theaters of choice, they could be different, and I think that makes foreign policy a much more complicated game with many more variables.
Well, I want to thank you on that note for your customarily sophisticated and subtle answers to many of the questions that I posed. For us, this is really a wonderful opportunity to hear you up close on issues that are not going away. And I only hope that we will have more occasions to engage with you as your time and circumstances permit, and that before too long, we will actually be able to welcome you once again in person at the endowment itself. As you can well imagine, the building is shut right now. We are in the process of a slow comeback, but hopefully within a few months, when travel begins in earnest and things hopefully go back to normal, we'll have a chance to see you in person in Washington. But let me really take the opportunity to thank you for spending the time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.